Hello there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. We're glad you could join us today. My name is Arthur Hicken. I'm the evangelist at Parasoft. I'm also known as the Code Curmudgeon. So, if you want to join me, get a cool hat. With me is my associate, Ricardo. Ricardo, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. Good morning, folks.
So, Ricardo and I, in preparation for this, decided that we had to spend many hours like watching airplanes. So it's been really, really rough for us. We had some good times staring at what's going on at San Diego Airport, where the planes come in right over your head. It's quite exciting, but it's a pretty interesting topic talking about airworthiness security requirements. And so today we're going to go through some of the basic things here. From a housekeeping perspective, on the right side, there's a little control box that you can play with there. You can stick your questions in, which we're happy to take. We'll probably, hold them till the end unless they're really urgent. But feel free to put them in as we go along. Um, if you have any problems, you can like reach through a chat there, and our staff will try to help you out. And again, there'll be a QA at the end. There will be, video and slides available afterward that will send you some links to it. And if everything looks fuzzy to you, we there's a little icon near the bottom right of your viewing area that can change the default resolution. Sometimes it gets set to a really, really low number. So if we look a little blurry, give that a try and see. Other than that, we'll probably turn the cameras off for the bulk of the presentation part. That way we can try and decrease the bandwidth and keep everything nice and sharp for all of you. So yeah. Let me turn mine off as well. And change this layout so it's just the slides, and here we go. So yeah, aircraft aren't alone. That we're going to talk about that. A glance at the standard, look at some ways that you can implement to verify and validate security requirements, and then take your questions, as I mentioned. So I think back to the days of Lindbergh and solo flight for many, many, many days across the country and across the ocean to France, and very much a solo operation. Once he's in the air, there was no air traffic to speak of other than birds. And now airplanes are connected, and they're connected in the air. They're connected when they're on the ground. They're always connected to lots and lots of different systems, and it's shocking even how many different systems are there. And so airplane security used to be the idea that you would keep a threat, an attacker, a hacker, a bad person away from your aircraft, and that was enough. But now these systems are all interlinked, and so there's so many threat entry points, and there's so many interesting things that they can potentially reach into. And so the issues have become more and more important, and sometimes simple things like hacking an infotainment system and doing the right thing on an aircraft can cross you into critical systems. So it's really, really important to remember that these systems are now connected to everything, and therefore they have greater capabilities but greater threats. So number one, if you've seen me talk before about especially safety critical devices, overflow. Overflow is the bane of safety and security. It's just especially in C and C++ applications, in others as well, but especially in C and C++, it's just so critical to make sure that you don't have read overflow, write overflow, numeric overflow, like a wraparound on a clock or a timer or things like that, because they can sneak up on you and you don't notice them right away. Um, One of the things that alerts me to the idea that I have some kind of an overflow problem is magic numbers, right? When you see like a system that fails after exactly 24 hours or exactly after 7 days or things like that, whenever there's magic numbers, there's probably some kind of an overflow problem. The real answer to most buffer problems is really to take a rigorous look at software engineering coding standards, things like the CERT Secure Coding Standard, MISRA, AUTOSAR, etc. Things that don't just look for bugs, but also try to enforce secure, safe usage of the language, and that'll really keep you in the right place. There have been numerous examples. I was joking with Ricardo yesterday that I could make a little scrolling list here of aircraft that are known to have had, overflow issues, even just integer overflow, where they had to be rebooted on a regular basis. But, like a Patriot missile defense system, the Airbus A350, the 787 Dreamliner, and you get these magic numbers, right? 248 days times 24 hours times 3,600 seconds, which is nearly the size of a maximum 32-bit signed integer. So it's just it's a common issue. And again, when these days get longer, when the number of days gets bigger, then it gets harder and harder to find. So just super important. There's a kind of a curmudgeonly bit of advice on this one blog that's linked there down below, but change all your data types to Boolean, right? You can only be wrong by one bit. But the underlying philosophy is actually not bad. It's you have kind of two problems when you're building these systems. One is if you build it with hard limits, then when you overflow the limit, you cause some kind of problem. And you build it with extremely flexible things, then again, things add up and start to create really big numbers and things go wrong. So making sure that you're right sizing what you're doing, that you're using the right variable types with the right expected ranges and the right expected protections to make sure that everything works as expected when it matters the most. Another thing I want to talk about is, there's this old saying, right? Just because you're not paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. And years ago in cybersecurity, particularly, people used to say, well, my organization or my application or my system or my hardware isn't the target of a threat actor. But these days, attacks are built on top of bots. They scan systems, they scan the internet looking for specific types of openings. And there's a lot of different reasons for attack. It used to be, you attacked a specific organization because of a specific reason. And now, you're looking for passwords and access credentials, potentially, ransomware. Is there data that we can hold hostage? Can we exfiltrate embarrassing data, etc.? So criminals are out to get you, even if they're not out to get you. It's you're on the list, right? It's just it's an option. And there's this group, TA2541, targeting systems. They target systems, including people are working from home now, and that can be the weakest link into your network, and then ultimately access to somewhere in your system. They have been doing standard off the shelf, what we call commodity malware. For example, sending you funny emails with funny word attachments. So, be careful when you're targeting your systems. Ricardo's going to talk a lot about, how do we build a good system, but make sure that all of that includes training for your staff so they recognize when they're, someone's trying to phish their way in, understand phishing attacks, etc. But the problems are real, right? The threats are happening and they increase on a regular basis across every industry. From a hardware perspective, there's a lot of things that can go wrong, right? And we've been thinking about these things for decades and decades as we try to build aircraft that are more and more safe. But now with cyber threats, we have to rethink some of the things. And, there was an ICS alert issued that the CAN bus networks on more than one vendor were vulnerable to attack if if there was physical access provided, right? So it's kind of like in a car where someone, if you leave the car unlocked, someone can get at the OBD port and get on the CAN bus in the car and then inject attacks. So it's one of those things that's there. And the great thing about small aircraft is that well maintained and well treated, they last forever. The terrible thing from a security perspective about small aircraft is that they last forever, and so they don't necessarily have the latest updates. So the ICS did note that some aircraft CAN bus systems are less safe than modern automotive systems. So it is extremely important. And I think not so much for you to go worry about, if you've got small aircraft, but to think about the issues that underlie this, making sure that your building systems are secure, because we do expect them to last and to be around for a long time. And it's interesting because the guidance from ICS was, make sure that you've put in place proper external systems, right? Think about real world scenarios and then approach it properly. So, for example, if you're leaving aircraft parked for long periods of time at an airport, does it have, are there hangars? Can we lock doors? Are there cameras? Are there security personnel? How frequently is it, you know, uh, visited by people who keep an eye on things? There's a whole lot of things that you can do in this case because it's a physical access attack. But what's a little concerning is that the response is that there's an over-reliance on the physical security of the airplanes, a belief that the planes are safe. And, I was reading an article just this morning, always looking for, what's in the news. And they were like, well, if you tried to steal an airplane, you get shot down pretty quickly. And it's like, that's not the point. And that way of thinking in it, like around this CAN bus issue, is what gets us in trouble. And that's what's so great about this standard that Ricardo's going to talk about, because the standard helps us understand this environment that we live in now, what the threats are, and what we can actually do when we're building systems. Because this kind of thinking that, well, I've got other mitigations, or it won't happen here, it won't happen to me. You might be right, but you really have to think it out properly. Otherwise, you get yourself into trouble. So, we just talked about tiny airplanes and a tiny attack against a tiny CAN bus, but now we look at modern aircraft, and you look at on the, the upper left triangle of this box, you see all of the in-flight connectivity systems, and some of them we've listed out how you get at them. Many of them are, various forms of RF, so you can talk to these things, right? And some of them will send you messages, and some of them you can send messages, etc. And they're all, threat points, right? They're potential danger spots in the system. And as I mentioned before, of course, even on the ground, we have various things going on that can be attacked. And so the attack surface went from, 0 in the time of Lindbergh, or 1, right? Like somebody could steal your plane. But and then we had the CAN bus, which is, relatively small and relatively easy to protect against. And now you have these really, really complex systems. And again, you can't just think that, well, this system's unimportant, so, it's only playing the movies for people, so who cares, right? They play the wrong movie, or the movies don't work. But frequently, because they're all connected to a bus and they talk to each other, that attackers can find their way across system boundaries and cause catastrophic failures to happen. So again, the problem is big, it's complex, but it's not overwhelming, and that is the point of the standard, is to help us get a handle on it. So Ricardo, I will pass the ball to you and let you tell us what we can do.
Yeah, thank you, Arthur. I want to make sure you guys can hear me.
Yeah, we got you.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, well, okay, so before I jump right into DO326A, I want to first put it in context of DO178, because DO178 is the overarching standard, so a quick mention is in order. Also, I'm going to give you a high-level overview of DO326A, and then I'm going to quickly put things in more concrete terms, or actionable terms, that us as systems and software engineers understand. So in other words, how does it apply to my existing tasks, processes, and deliverables? All right, so let's get started. So DO178 is a process standard containing guidelines dealing with the software used in airborne systems. DO-178C is the latest version, referred to as ED-12C in Europe. And again, it provides guidance used by aerospace systems and software engineers to ensure airworthiness. Now, the image on the right is a quick view of the sections contained in the standard. However, one document cannot encompass all development needs. So supporting or complementing documents have evolved over time, such as DO326A and others that you actually see on the list. And anyways, in some circles, DO326A is referred to as the cyber version of DO-178 because the approach in addressing cybersecurity overlaps with much of what is done for safety. And this is captured in a V-model diagram in the DO326A standard. So if you've been building software systems that are safe, incorporating security will be somewhat intuitive. Now, DO326A is mandatory by the FAA and EASA, and there's an interesting story around that, and actually that I've mentioned to Arthur, and actually he knows about the story because he knows all the stories. On December of 2017, a passenger on board a major international airline thought it would be funny to rename his iPhone's personal Wi-Fi hotspot account Bomb on Board. So during the flight, when the other passengers looked to available Wi-Fi addresses, they went into a bit of a panic, and which caused the airplane to be diverted, and so caused all kinds of havoc. Anyway, this event triggered the European Union Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, to actually adopt and make DO326A mandatory, and as well as the FAA. So now, also worth mentioning, Arthur and I actually delivered a DO-178 webinar, which you might be interested in. So I've provided a QR code on one of our last slides where you might actually want to watch that recording. I think it'll be very interesting and educational. Now, in 2006, EUROCAE formed Working Group 72, or WG72. And in 2007, RTCA formed a Special Committee 216, both named Aeronautical Systems Security. And this began the process that yielded DO326A or ED202A European standard. The first version of DO326A was published in 2010 called Airworthiness Process Specification. But it lacked information or content on security. It contained the best practices as best understood at the time. And since security had not been widely implemented in the industry, it was lacking a little bit. The current publication of the standard, Airworthiness Security Process Specification, was put out on August of 2014, along with companion document DO355. And I'm going to go into a little bit on these companion documents. Anyways, a key important or contributing element of the latest version of DO326A is that it includes the focus of malicious intent, because just looking at incorporating security in the system leaves gaps that bad people can use for sabotage. So intentional and unintentional threat is considered. DO326A is also a process document. That means that it focuses on the what and not the how. So there are objectives defined to be satisfied in order to reach the goal of obtaining what is referred to as type certification. Also, guidance and recommendations on how we can keep avionics systems secure have been dispersed across several documents. DO356A, or Europe's equivalent, ED203A, is titled Airworthiness, Security Methods and Considerations. It is a companion document to be considered. It provides airworthiness security requirements throughout the stages of development, and it spells out details on risk assessment and objectives to be achieved. Now, another complementing document is standard DO355, as I mentioned. It is titled Information Security Guidance for Continuing Airworthiness. It's a collection of supplementary requirements focused on operation and maintenance. Now, the core of DO326A is to establish the airworthiness security process. The term has been abbreviated, as you see on the slide here, AWSP. And the standard is the top-level guidance for attaining airworthiness security certification. As I mentioned, this the certification is required by the FAA and EASA, and this is for general civil aviation, like fixed wing and prop aircraft, also rotorcraft like helicopters and others. And this includes the engines and propellers as well. It's also important to note that currently military aircraft is not addressed by DO326A, though it is under consideration. So this image here captures the overview of the airworthiness security process. We don't have time to go into complete detail, but I will take you through each step. I will also put focus on the life cycle phases, which are primarily captured in Chapter 3 of the standard, where I believe most of the importance in this standard is found. As you can see that here on the screen, steps 2, 3, 5, and 6 reference sections in Chapter 3. Now, starting at the top, you have steps 1 and 7, which express how to manage the actual certification process. There is a plan that needs to be put together, which is step 1. And actually, this plan is very, very important. It contains things like the risk assessment for the aircraft or system, which includes essential processes like assurance level assignment, security requirements captured, security requirements validation, and it serves as other inputs to further activities down the development lifecycle. Also, this document has to be in agreement with the regulatory authority because other supporting documents like the aircraft security scope definition, which captures the operational environment for the aircraft, as it relates to security, may be required by the authority. Now, this is to give you a sample visual of an aircraft environment when considering security. As you remember, Arthur put this really nice graphic up there, also similarly showing this. Now, other documents like the preliminary aircraft security risk assessment also captures all identified threat conditions, scenarios, along with security risk assessment levels that may be needed, or even a software design document may need to be included in this plan. So work it out with your regulatory authority. Something that comes into play here is if there is just modifications that are being made to the system or not for certification. Now, anyways, evidence to support the plan or PSAC document includes things like assigned security assurance level, results in the verification and validation of requirements, and more are to be included in the plan, which is step 7. Now, steps 2 is where you establish the scope, or in other words, identify the assets that are to be put through the airworthiness security process. These will be the logical and or physical assets in development, but it's important to understand that it involves different levels of abstraction. For example, you can start by looking at things from the perspective of the aircraft and consider assets like external communication systems, the interactions that happens between them, including with off-board personnel. Now, at a lower level of abstraction, you have to also consider the system and its internal assets, the system, the subsystems, the interfaces, the data, the file transfer, and much more, because these assets also need to be secured. Oops, let me back here. Now, step 3 is where you perform your security risk assessment. This is really important, and this is very similar to how you evaluate and assign your design assurance level, or DAL, in safety. So I think you guys are probably very familiar with this. Now, this is figure 3.3-2 from the standard, which shows the workflow defined in determining the security risk assessment level. This is level of threat and severity. Chapter 3 goes into further detail, such as providing asset security attributes and threat conditions. The table shows here is an example of a constructed matrix. Now, based on the security assessment level assigned, it affects the various verification validation methods to perform and assure that the asset is secure. And actually, this feeds into step 4. Now, step 4 is a decision gate. If there is a security risk, evidence of assessment and mitigation measures need to be produced, which feeds steps 5, 6, and 7. Step 5 is where security protection is implemented in the design. Step 6 measures the effectiveness of the security protection implemented. Now, steps 5 and 6 are given additional detail in this diagram. Additional security requirements are defined, and architectural decisions are made in support of those high-level security requirements. And all of these requirements need to be satisfied and measured for effectiveness. This means testing. The results are what feed step 7. So step 7 is where all evidence of activities and results is captured for certification purposes. So let's put these steps into something more concrete, something that we are a little more familiar with. I'm assuming you are all very familiar with the V model. This image is from the DO326A standard, and it puts things in the context of security. It captures the phases of the software development lifecycle. On the left side of the V, we have the systems engineering phases where you capture requirements. This is where step 2 in the DO326A process comes into place. As you can see, you have abstraction levels of security requirements analysis that you need to consider, where requirements are identified and also need to be decomposed. When I say requirements, these include the collection of regulatory as well as stakeholder requirements, which we should all be very familiar with in performing our systems engineering task. This process is very well defined in DO178. And the key difference here is that we are adding security process, which is, again, well defined in DO326A. So note that there is also a security risk assessment to be made. If the security assessment level requires threat mitigation, it must be designed into the system, and a test to verify the effectiveness of the solution against the threat must be defined. As systems engineers, we capture all of our requirements in our PLM, ALM, or requirements management tool. That's where they get decomposed, traceability is established, as well as down to the test cases, and in fact, also down to the code in many cases. On the right side of the V, we perform the verification validation of our requirements. The security requirements, just like safety requirements, need to be evaluated through our verification validation methods. Artifacts are produced, and this feeds our compliance and certification needs, which is again feeds step 7 in the process. So I've mapped the DO326A V model into how Parasoft supports it. So actually, let's take a look at this graphic. Okay. As you can see, this is a high-level view of the solution that we offer for each of the phases in DO326A, V model and airworthiness security process. Now, on the left side of the V, note that we have integrations with solutions like JAMA, Codebeamer, Polarian, and others, which complement Parasoft and help fulfill requirements traceability as defined in DO 178 and required in DO 326A for all of your security requirements. And on the right-hand side of the V, we have a plethora of test automation solutions in the verification and validation development phases. Starting with static analysis at the implementation level, here you are shifting left by identifying all coding bugs at the earliest stages of development when they are the cheapest to fix. Though coding standards, or through coding standards like NISRA, they have security built into them, but you can actually augment it with CERT or CWE, the Common Weakness Enumeration, or OWASP. This is where you can identify and fix security vulnerabilities that may have been introduced during implementation. We continue to move up the right side of the V with test automations for unit testing, integration testing, and system testing. And actually, this can also be performed on the target hardware. On the bottom right of your screen, you can see many of the testing methods that we provide in support of DO 326A and DO 178C for compliance and certification needs. Now, we automatically generate reports necessary to show effectiveness or proof of satisfying these requirements. Also, be aware that Parasoft solutions have been TÜV SÜD certified for use on your safety critical applications. Of course, for DO 178, we provide a tool qualification kit to certify for your development ecosystem. Also, since security vulnerabilities heavily come about from connected devices and services, DO 326A actually provides a list of many of these external connections that you should consider or assess. The standard provides what they call is a list of E-enabled systems, so that you can consider and also consider the integrity and robustness of the configuration. There are many. See here a list to consider, and now you notice the one that says passenger-owned devices. Now you know why that's also on the list, because of the guy with the cell phone. So assess security threats and make sure to thoroughly test the effectiveness of the solution put in place. Again, Parasoft provides test methods like structural code coverage, UI testing, fuzz testing, API testing, service virtualization, and others. This is in support of security for avionics. And we integrate with your modern CI/CD pipeline. We have integrations with Azure, GitLab, Jenkins, GitHub, and so on. Okay, anyways, that was the what I wanted to cover. Make sure that we give you a nice glance at the standard. We're now going to be opening it up for Q&A. But first, I provided a QR code, as I mentioned, to take you to a demo video of CC++ test in action. Also on the right side, we have the DO 178C webinar and a very informative white paper. Also, you can follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, or send us an email at info@parasoft.com. Okay, over to you, Arthur, for any Q&A.
Yeah. So, and just another mention as well. We are in all these places, as you mentioned, and also on YouTube. And in fact, this, this webinar can be found on YouTube. So, check that out too. Just wherever works for you, we're there. One of the questions that came in was, can we get the charts? And yeah, we'll be sending out links to the presentation so you can get whatever you need. If you're asking further about like, where do I get a copy of the standard? We can't send it to you, but we can send you the link. If that's what you're asking, just, put another question in the system and we'll mention it. Or Ricardo, did we get this one through like ANSI? I usually buy my standards through ANSI.org, but
yeah, RTCA. I purchased a standard from their site.
Yeah, so I guess that's the trick for those who haven't gotten copies of standards before, is that you have to recognize that most of these standards cost money, and so you have to go somewhere and buy them. So you can scour the internet for quite a while and find out that you're getting like summaries and overviews and things. But if you really need to support the standard, you just need to go to one of the authorizing bodies. RTCA, ISO, ANSI, SAE, etc., and they all have links to places to purchase it, and that's your best bet. Then you have a canonical version, you know it's right, you know it works. So and up to date, right? Buy the latest one, don't buy the old ones. I've almost made that mistake even recently on a standard that that updated, but somehow when I did the search for it, it showed me the old one, and I went, wait a minute,
Yeah,
that looks
me
old.
too.
And with that in mind, one of the other questions, Ricardo, was how does standard ARP 475-4A work with 326A?
Okay. Yeah, actually, that's a good question because that covers a lot of the avionics airworthiness information there. So obviously, you know that ARP 4754A provides the complete aerospace systems development process. Um, you know, you get a very well-defined development guidelines with it. And it takes into account the overall aircraft operating environment and functions, which perfectly complement DO 178 because it fills in the blanks regarding process, very heavy process-oriented standard. For example, it describes what happens in each development phase in greater detail. Anyways, ARP 4754A does not address software security. DO 326A does. What you want to do is incorporate the cybersecurity process defined in 326A into your already existing development process. The one you are currently following for, which is the one you currently following for 4754A, or if you put something in place for DO 178. The merging of these standards boil down to when you go through in identifying and decomposing your requirements. Following these process standards, you will end up with requirements for safety, security, and quality of service, all which need to be fulfilled in the design and architecture, and of course implemented in the code and validated through testing.
You know, it's funny, Ricardo, right? Because there's always a core guiding document, and inside of there, essentially you end up with sections or sub-documents or related documents for hardware and software and for safety and security. So yeah, if you're doing hardware safety, there's a document. If you're doing hardware security, there's a document. But if it's the software, then there's another one. So yeah, just keep that in mind. You might think that, oh, I saw something that said like aviation security. It might be the hardware document, right? Just make sure you get all your ducks together, right? Before you think that you're good to go. What about building security into the hardware? When does that come into play?
Yeah. I mean, so the focus of this is our presentation is software, but because we satisfy requirements for testing on target hardware, we have some familiarity with the standards for electronic hardware. It's actually DO 254. The way this works or comes into play is during systems engineering. In the course of your requirements analysis, you separate your identified requirements by discipline. You end up with software requirements, hardware requirements, mechanical requirements, and so on. For hardware, they have their own safety and security process development life cycles to follow. DO 254 is for hardware security. Anyhow, at the end, you end up with an all-around safe, secure, and reliable avionics systems if you've followed all your processes and standards that are applied.
Yeah, it's a fascinating world now, right? When you're blending hardware and software together at such deep, complex levels, right? Can you talk a little more about effectiveness assurance that was mentioned in step 6?
Yeah, step 6. It's all about the testing. So, yeah, this is very important, and I mean we could spend like so much more time. But anyways, as I mentioned, you need to assure that your security requirement implementation is effective. In other words, it works. It mitigates or eliminates the risk. You do this through testing. DO 326A has a section on security verification. It states that you need to test all your security requirements, perform robustness testing, and vulnerability testing. These are somewhat broad strokes, as they're described in the book or the standard. But then again, they should be, because DO326A is about the what, not the how. So Parasoft offers you the how. At the low level or implementation phase, we recommend you start with static analysis to coding standards like CERT, MISRA, AUTOSAR for C++, CWE. We even have support JSF. And there are others as well, or you can actually build your own from all of these standards, or create your own rule. Our analysis engines will also find coding violations, and because Parasoft can perform data and control flow analysis, so we can also identify security vulnerabilities during the scan. You will also want to employ unit testing to make sure your units or functions are secure. For example, making sure you have accessors and getters for all of your variables or data, which they can perform a security action or check before modifying or sending any data out. But because there are different types of software applications, such as in network connections, which they tend to have security vulnerabilities, you will want to perform other testing methods like penetration testing or API security testing, and other testing techniques like cross-site scripting and more. Anyways, Parasoft supports these testing methods, and so it's ultimately really up to you to look at your application, determine the kinds of testing methods that are going to provide that effectiveness, and ensure that your security solutions are implemented and tested, and you have that quality system delivered.
Yeah, and you know what? It sounds like a lot of effort, and you've got basic functionality, you've got quality that you should be worrying about, probably, right? Especially if you're trying to keep a big metal box flying in the air. Safety is something that you worry about. Security now feels like it's this big, extra heavy effort, but hopefully what you've understood from here is that the things that you need to do, static analysis, gather requirements, good unit testing coverage so you know what you tested, things like that, documenting the process, they're the same practices. They're 80% of it is the same thing. So it's not like when you add security, you're doubling the work. If you've done everything else right, if you already have rigorous static analysis and unit test and coverage set up for your safety, and you want to add security, it's not going to be that heavy of a lift. All you're left with at that point is some threat modeling, right? Like, what can happen to me, and let me see if the software can handle it, and if not, let me mitigate it. But it's all of the 80% of the software stuff is build the software right. Don't allow buffer overflows. Don't allow tainted data to travel through your system. Know who you're talking to, right? Like, make sure that you don't pass off data to someone who's not supposed to get it. It's all, normal kind of stuff. So, not that hard. So, Ricardo, it's been fun today. We do have other topics coming up. I don't even remember. We're going to another air-oriented show in a couple of weeks, so we'll probably do a little live broadcast from there. So we'll see you guys then. And if you've got other topics, questions, please reach out to us at any of the links here below, or directly, and hit us up on Twitter, etc. If there's something you want to hear, a standard you want to know more about, we're happy to take it on. And with that, again, thanks, Ricardo, and thanks everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.